everybody. Welcome to the third part on the module on sustainable development. In this particular part, we're going to discuss two conferences, the Rio Conference of 1992 and the World Summit on Sustainable Development 2002. Now, in the last decade of the 20th century, the UN was very interested in the idea of sustainable development, and it started to set up these mega conferences, meaning all actors from around the world, non-governmental, action-oriented, people from the ground, green parties, as well as different country representatives were invited to these conferences. We're going to look at two of them that defined these 2 decades. All right, one is the Rio Conference 1992 and 2 is the World Summit on Sustainable Development WSSD that was held in Johannesburg in 2002. They defined the way international parties or international governments and governments around the world would look and define sustainable development. Now, Rio, 1992. Rio was held in Rio and decides to bring together all concerns of sustainable development. It brings out a document that was called Agenda 21. Now, Agenda 21 again is something that's freely available online, but it's a huge document. It is 600 pages with 40 separate chapters. This huge document was probably one of the most encompassing documents when it comes to the idea of sustainable development. It comes up with 27 principles for sustainable development. So, by the end of Rio, the Rio Declaration says that these are the 27 documents or 27 principles you need to follow for sustainable development, and it goes on to explain it in these 40 chapters. Now, these 40 chapters are divided into 4 sections. You have one that covers socio-economic issues. The other one covers environmental aspects of sustainable development. The third section covers actors. Who are the actors? What should they do? How should they deal with the idea of sustainable development? And finally, the fourth section is on the means by which we implement all the various 27 principles that were identified. Agenda 21 covers a lot of ground. It covers a lot of discussions. It talks of how to manage the environment and development. It talks of what types of laws we require. Agenda 21 describes the vital actions that are required in order to promote sustainability. But you should remember something. Even though it has these 27 principles, and these 27 principles in fact have also informed a lot of judgments on environment around the world, including in India, none of these 27 principles were mandatory. All right, these were voluntary principles. These were principles that different countries agreed upon, but they were not binding on any one country. You might be wondering why the title Agenda 21. It again comes down to Maurice Strong. Now, Maurice Strong, when he was proposing this particular conference, basically called this particular document Agenda 21 because it was in 1992. They were looking at the coming of the new century, the 21st century. So he basically wanted a document that would set the world on the path of sustainability in the new century, the 21st century, hence Agenda 21. Agenda 21, therefore, is the most comprehensive document on the ideas of sustainable development. So even though Agenda 21 was not mandatory, what comes out of the Rio conference, what comes as a fallout of Agenda 21 are two very, very important, not binding in a way, one is basically a convention and one is the idea that takes over the entire discourse of sustainable development. What is the convention? The Convention on Biological Diversity. Now, a convention is binding. If a party actually signs on to a convention like India has, then you are bound by it, which is why we have our Biodiversity Act, right? So the Convention on Biodiversity was signed at Rio. It was a convention to conserve biological diversity, promote the sustainable use of species and ecosystems, and the equitable sharing of benefits of genetic resources. Signed 1992, comes into force 1993. So, even though Agenda 21 is not binding, this convention and those who signed up to it, who were parties to it, was a binding document. Now, what was the second thing? One of the second big things that comes out of this was the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Climate change is how we understand sustainable development today, right? This Framework Convention on Climate Change was agreed on at Rio. Now, you should remember that the scientists of the world come together and publish the IPCC report in 1990. This report, IPCC report, informs the people of this particular convention, and by 1992 they come together, all the countries of the world, and they form the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, the Framework Convention on Climate Change leads to a series of meetings. These series of meetings basically are the conferences of parties that take place. Now, the Framework Convention on Climate Change comes into force in 1994, but you should remember, like every document of climate change that we have today in 2019, even the one that comes into effect in 1994 was not binding on any parties. It was a recognition that human beings and their different efforts and lifestyles was affecting the climate of the world, and that if we want to live in the world that we have today and to have it for generations to come, we have to deal with the consequence of our actions. Scientific evidence on this was also provided, and it comes into force in 1994, but it was not binding. The Conference of Parties keep meeting over decades. Finally, you have an agreement that is established in Kyoto in 1997, and you have something called as the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol comes into force in 2004, and again the Kyoto Protocol is also not binding. The next module will deal with these issues. Nevertheless, it tells you how important Rio was. Rio brought in this connect between the discussion on sustainable development and brought it within the context of climate change, and understood that if we're talking of sustainable development, we also have to talk about climate change. It made sustainable development a talking point. It ensured that any debate on development would have to be understood in the context of sustainability. It brought in ideas in terms of how we have to restructure the way we have profits or make profits, how we have to understand biospheres and ecosystems. It talked of the cost of technologies that are green and how they have to be brought down. They talked of inequalities in wealth, technology, and environmental hazards and life changes. All of this was spoken of in Agenda 21. Agenda 21, therefore, was massive. It discussed all of these issues. The probable failure of Rio was that it was not able to actually mobilize funds to ensure that Agenda 21 became a reality. However, 10 years later, we have the next summit, the World Summit on Sustainable Development. Now, finally, the summit itself is titled World Summit on Sustainable Development. Rio was called the Conference on Environment and Development, but in 2002 you have the World Summit on Sustainable Development held in Johannesburg, South Africa. 10 years after Rio, what did it want to do? It basically garnered worldwide attention to what we were discussing in Rio. It brought attention to two things. One, Agenda 21 that came out as a product of Rio, as well as the Millennium Development Goals that were discussed by the UN in a previous conference in 2002. Now, this particular conference was attended by 22,000 people. It included 82 heads of state. So remember, the first conference in 1972 was attended only by 2 heads of state, one of which was Indira Gandhi. By the time we come to 2002, we have 22,000 people and 82 heads of state. Now, conspicuous in their absence was the US President. George W. Bush, who was the president at that point of time, did not attend. The US has successfully fought against any global targets on environment or sustainability. In fact, the US representative, the Secretary of State Colin Powell, was heckled by many of the members during the World Summit on Sustainable Development. And we know that even till today, the current US President Donald Trump had the ability to say that climate change is a Chinese hoax. This is nothing new. This has been a stance that the United States has taken for many, many years. However, other government leaders, other government state heads have not done that. However, 10 years later, we have the next summit, the World Summit on Sustainable Development. Now, finally, the summit itself is titled World Summit on Sustainable Development. Rio was called the Conference on Environment and Development, but in 2002 you have the World Summit on Sustainable Development held in Johannesburg, South Africa. 10 years after Rio, what did it want to do? It basically garnered worldwide attention to what we were discussing in Rio. It brought attention to two things. One, Agenda 21 that came out as a product of Rio, as well as the Millennium Development Goals that were discussed by the UN in a previous conference in 2002. Now, this particular conference was attended by 22,000 people. It included 82 heads of state. So remember, the first conference in 1972 was attended only by 2 heads of state, one of which was Indira Gandhi. By the time we come to 2002, we have 22,000 people and 82 heads of state. Now, conspicuous in their absence was the US President. George W. Bush, who was the president at that point of time, did not attend. The US has successfully fought against any global targets on environment or sustainability. In fact, the US representative, the Secretary of State Colin Powell, was heckled by many of the members during the World Summit on Sustainable Development. And we know that even till today, the current US President Donald Trump had the ability to say that climate change is a Chinese hoax. This is nothing new. This has been a stance that the United States has taken for many, many years. The Johannesburg Plan of Implementation comes out thanks to this particular summit, and it talks of various issues. It moves across issues such as unsustainable patterns of consumption and production. It talks of the protection and management of natural resource based on economic and social development. It talks of globalization and health. So in conclusion, by tracing how the idea of sustainable development evolved through a series of international conferences, we understand the discourse around sustainable development. We understand how this concept becomes the fundamental talking point for public policy. And we also understand its link to climate change. Now, to recap, I would like to recap the different issues that we spoke of across this module. We start 1972 with Stockholm. First, bringing in the concerns of the first world and the third world, saying that environment and development have to be spoken together, have to be spoken about together, that poverty is important. Then we move on to the World Conservation Strategy, 1980. Then we move on to Our Common Future, 1987. Caring for the Earth, 1991. All three documents that bring in the idea of conservation, the definitions of sustainability, and the value and ethic of sustainability. By the time we land in Rio in 1992, we have the next step, wherein which they come out with 27 principles and Agenda 21 being a 600-page bloated document that talks of everything concerning sustainable development, and finally bringing it within the context of climate change, saying that this is not an isolated issue. You can't talk of sustainability and development only by the Ministry of Environment. We have to it concerns everything. It concerns every sector, and hence climate change also has to be discussed in this context. And all our discussions on climate change, even till today, are based on these concepts that were established over these 3 decades. Hence, today, when we understand the idea of sustainable development, we see it as something that everybody knows, right? We see the Sustainable Development Goals. We know that the Prime Minister talks of this. We know that the UN chairman talks of this. We know that the World Bank talks of this. The reason it's become so commonplace, the reason this concept has become so powerful is because of this history. So I hope you've understood what we mean by sustainable development and its history and its importance. Thank you.